The Missouri Breaks was not just Arthur Penn's most catastrophically misunderstood film. It was a $10 million collision between two of the greatest actors in American cinema history. Assembled by a producer who lied to all three principals to get them in the same room, presided over by a director who openly admitted he had no idea why he was making it, and systematically dismantled in front of the cameras by a star who showed up with cue cards, a fake Irish brogue, a granny dress, and a threat to walk through his part if the script was not rewritten to his specifications. We are digging into the wreckage of the Missouri Breaks with 15 secrets the studio tried to bury. Secrets locked inside trade filings, production records, out-of-print memoirs, and the kind of interview transcripts that only surface when you know which archives to search. The title, The Missouri Breaks, refers to a precise geographical phenomenon. The area of north-central Montana, where the Missouri River has, over geological time, cut deep ravines and fractures into the surrounding land, a scarred, broken terrain where the earth itself has been pulled apart by persistent pressure. Elliot Kastner's marketing division received this title and found it acceptably evocative. What nobody in 1975 appears to have observed is that it also described, with geological precision, what was about to happen to the production. The script was wordy and structurally unwieldy. Its three primary creative collaborators, Penn, Brando, and Nicholson, had each privately assessed it as, in Penn's own words to the French film magazine Ecrin, interesting but not filmable. The terrain of the Missouri Breaks was broken before principal photography began. The title was not an announcement. It was a diagnosis. The assembly of Arthur Penn, Marlon Brando, and Jack Nicholson on a single production represents one of the more audacious acts of producer manipulation in New Hollywood history, and the mechanism by which Elliot Kastner achieved it was straightforward fabrication. As Penn himself documented in his interview with Ecrin, Kastner approached each of the three men separately, telling Penn that Brando was already attached, telling Brando that Penn had committed, and telling Nicholson that both Penn and Brando were on board when in fact none of them had signed. The three-way conditional agreement that resulted, each man committed only if the other two were, depended on a foundation of mutual deception that Kastner had constructed brick by fraudulent brick. Penn's subsequent observation is one of the more precise pieces of self-criticism in directorial interview history. We weren't actually interested in the film so much as working with each other. This probably isn't the best reason to embark on such a massive project. The greatest Western cast of the 1970s was assembled on a lie. The film they made reflects that instability in every frame. Arthur Penn arrived on the Montana locations in July 1975 as the director of Bonnie and Clyde, still the most culturally consequential single film of the New Hollywood movement, the picture that had restructured American cinema's relationship to violence, genre, and audience. And as a man who had not made a commercially successful film since 1970. Little Big Man had been his last great film, and by the accounts of those closest to him, the psychological fallout from that production's mixed reception had been severe. Night Moves in 1975 had been the kind of rigorous, downbeat, genuinely intelligent film that the post-Watergate audience found too painful to sit with voluntarily. By the time Penn reached Montana, he had spent 5 years failing to recapture the momentum of a single film made in 1967. The Missouri Breaks was, in the logic of his career, a last serious bid to establish that the director of Bonnie and Clyde had not become a historical artifact. What he delivered instead was a film that confirmed to everyone who reviewed it in 1976 that he had. Penn never made another film of comparable ambition. He later told the Boston Globe simply, "I was out of fashion, my time was over." The Missouri Breaks was the exact moment that sentence became true. Thomas McGuane was, in 1975, simultaneously one of the most significant novelists of the American West and the most chaotically combustible human being in the literary world. His biographers described the period between 1973 and 1977, which produced the Missouri Breaks screenplay, as the era in which McGuane earned the nickname Captain Berserko, a compressed interval of professional implosion that included a Porsche crash on an icy Texas highway that left him speechless for days, an affair with actress Elizabeth Ashley, a divorce from his first wife, a marriage to actress Margot Kidder, a second divorce, and the deaths of his father, mother, and sister in a 30-month span. Kastner paid $400,000 for the screenplay that emerged from this period, a substantial sum that reflected genuine respect for the material's structural intelligence. McGuane then left the country before filming began. By the time he returned, Brando and Nicholson had begun reconceptualizing the film around their own improvisational instincts, and Robert Towne, the screenwriter of Chinatown, brought in as an uncredited script doctor, was rewriting McGuane's dialogue with the kind of quiet surgical authority that leaves no fingerprints. McGuane's assessment of the finished production, delivered to an interviewer years later, was stripped to its essence. The pus actually got on the walls. He was describing the film he had written, he was describing it accurately. But the real problem was that the single most disruptive force on the production had not yet shown up for work. Before Brando arrived with his reinvention, Robert E. Lee Clayton existed in McGuane's screenplay as a specific and historically grounded figure based, as production records confirm, on Tom Horn, the 19th century hired gun whose career as a Pinkerton detective and contract killer for Wyoming ranchers had ended with his execution in 1903 for the murder of a 14-year-old boy. McGuane's Clayton carried this lineage. An American, a professional, a man whose violence was institutional rather than pathological, whose services represented the convergence of law and capital that had always characterized the regulation of the frontier. The character Brando delivered was none of these things. His Clayton spoke in an invented Irish brogue, wore a dress for one sequence and a Chinese coolie hat for another, quoted poetry to his horse with apparent romantic feeling, and announced his arrivals with the theatrical grandiosity of a performer who had decided the script was merely a suggestion. Brando explained his invention to Time magazine in May 1976, casually noting that he had changed the entire flavor of his character and invented a new weapon for Clayton to use because he had always been expert at knife throwing. The historical Tom Horn, whose biography McGuane had studied, received no mention. The Irish brogue had no historical justification. Brando had replaced the character with something more interesting to Brando, and nobody on the production had the institutional standing to stop him. The single most documented production dysfunction in the Missouri Breaks, recorded in AFI catalog records, trade correspondence, and multiple actor accounts, was Brando's systematic use of cue cards to avoid learning his dialogue. This was not, by 1975, a new development in Brando's working practice. The cue cards had appeared on The Godfather, on Last Tango in Paris, on every major production he had made since the late 1960s. What distinguished their use on the Missouri Breaks was the Baroque ingenuity of their placement. During the garden confrontation with Nicholson, the cards were arranged among a row of cabbages. For a scene requiring Brando to face John McLiam directly, Brando requested that the cards be pasted to McLiam's face. When McLiam protested that he would be unable to see, Brando suggested cutting holes for his eyes. The cards were ultimately attached to the wall behind McLiam, who emerged with his dignity and his sight. Nicholson, who had come to the production specifically to work alongside the man he considered the greatest living actor, watched all of this and eventually went on record with the question the entire cast was asking. Marlon's still the greatest actor in the world, so why does he need those goddamn cue cards? Penn, who had directed Brando once before on The Chase in 1966 and who had watched that production deteriorate under similar conditions, made no effort to control him. He had decided to let Brando do whatever he wanted. That decision is the film's central wound and its central fascination, simultaneously. What the production records held in the AFI catalog document, and what has received almost no serious critical attention, is that Brando's most consequential act of disruption on the Missouri Breaks was not the cue cards, not the costumes, not the mooning of the crew, or the childish pranks with rubber spiders. It was a demand. Brando had accepted the role, as Vogue reported, specifically to finance two projects he considered genuinely important: a documentary about the plight of Native Americans, and sea farming experiments on his South Pacific island of Titiaroa. The film was, in his private assessment, a commercial vehicle for causes he found more meaningful than the film itself. From this position of declared indifference, he demanded that the production rewrite Tom Logan, Nicholson's character, as a Native American. The request was denied. Brando then threatened to walk through his part. The threat was neither empty nor idle. A Brando who had decided to perform without engagement would have been visible on screen in precisely the way the production could not afford. The concession extracted was the creative latitude that produced everything that follows: the dress, the brogue, the cabbages, the horse soliloquy. The character who appears in the finished film is the character Brando improvised after being denied the film he actually wanted to make. The ending of the Missouri Breaks, the scene in which Tom Logan shoots the bedridden David Braxton, a conclusion that McGuane never wrote and never endorsed, was constructed on set by Penn, Nicholson, and Robert Towne during the final weeks of production. Towne, whose uncredited contribution to the screenplay extended well beyond this single scene into the film's dialogue and structural architecture, appears nowhere in the film's official credits. His work is visible throughout the finished film in the same way that the best script doctoring always is, in the moments where the prose achieves a precision and compression that the credited writer's other work does not quite reach. The line delivered by the Hell's Gate rancher, a miniature speech about Jefferson and the American dream of class ascension that concludes with a rancher raising cattle so his son can be a merchant, so his grandson can move to Newport, Rhode Island, and never see these mountains again, is not McGuane's register. It has the burnished, aphoristic density that Towne had been perfecting since Chinatown. He wrote it and received nothing for it. The scene that audiences most frequently cite as the film's most eloquent statement about the American frontier myth was produced by a man whose name is not on the film. The Missouri Breaks was Arthur Penn's third Western, and the three films together constitute one of the more coherent and underexamined bodies of work in the American genre tradition. The Left-Handed Gun in 1958 had applied method psychology to Billy the Kid. Little Big Man in 1970 had used a panoramic historical canvas to systematically demolish every myth the genre had accumulated. The Missouri Breaks completed the trilogy by removing the myth entirely and examining what remained, not the frontier's romance or its violence or even its injustice, but its economic logic, the naked mechanism by which capital hires licensed violence to protect property from unlicensed violence, and calls the distinction law. What Clayton represents is not evil. He represents the legitimate use of lethal force in service of property rights. What Logan represents is not heroism. He represents the unauthorized use of the same force in service of personal survival. The only difference between them is the contract Braxton has signed. Penn had been making this argument since 1958, refining it through 3 decades and 3 westerns, and in 1976 he made it with the most precise and the most uncomfortable clarity he had ever achieved. The critics who called the film muddled were watching a film that was, in its moral argument, the most unmuddled Western of its era. John Williams composed the Missouri Breaks score in the year between Jaws and Star Wars, the precise fulcrum point of his transformation from a sophisticated Hollywood journeyman into the most commercially dominant film composer in history. The score he produced for Penn's film is therefore a document of Williams at the last moment before the orchestral maximalism of the franchise era consumed his public identity entirely. What he wrote was quiet, slightly comic, grounded in folk and bluegrass idioms, and almost entirely free of the heroic gestures that Star Wars would make his permanent signature 12 months later. Critics in 1976, who assessed it as generic, were measuring it against Williams's prior work on disaster films and thrillers. They were not measuring it against the register the film actually required. The restraint Penn had demanded, a score that undercut rather than amplified the Western's mythological vocabulary, was precisely what Williams delivered and precisely what nobody recognized. It is the most invisible major Williams score in his catalog, and its invisibility was the point. The financial architecture of the Missouri Breaks contains a detail that the studio never publicized and that reveals, more precisely than any critical analysis, the exact value each participant placed on the project they were making. Production records documented in the Los Angeles Times in August 1976 show that Brando received $1 million plus 10% of gross receipts above $10 million for 5 weeks of work. Nicholson received $1,250,000 plus 10% of gross receipts above $12,500,000 for 10 weeks. Kathleen Lloyd, who carried the film's only functional romantic arc, whose performance as Jane Braxton was the production's most consistently grounded piece of work, and whose 8 days of preliminary meetings with Penn, McGuane, and the casting director represented a more thorough creative preparation than either of the film's 2 stars brought to their roles, received $20,000. The ratio of Brando's salary to Lloyd's is 50-1. The ratio of the critical attention their respective performances received in 1976 was roughly equivalent. Lloyd made very few significant films afterward. The economic logic of the Missouri Breaks, the powerful extracting disproportionate value from the infrastructure that supports them, was not confined to the film's narrative. It was embedded in the production's payroll. In August 1975, during the filming of a river crossing sequence on the Yellowstone River that required the principal actors on horseback to ford the current, a horse named Jug drowned. The production notes record the incident without ceremony. What the record does not capture is what a drowning horse on a Western location, shoot in 1975, communicated to a cast and crew who were already operating in conditions of sustained creative dysfunction, that the landscape itself was hostile, that the production's relationship to the physical world it was trying to depict was adversarial, and that the Montana terrain of the Missouri Breaks was not performing for the camera any more reliably than Brando was. Penn had spent his career making films about the gap between American mythology and American reality. The Missouri Breaks narrowed that gap to nothing. The mythology drowned in the Yellowstone River in August, and the production kept filming. The critical reception of the Missouri Breaks in May 1976 was a consensus built on a single visual impression delivered in language that ranged from the measured to the contemptuous. Vincent Canby in the New York Times praised Penn's landscape work and Nicholson's grounded performance, while describing Brando's contribution as an out-of-control display of campy mugging that fragmented the narrative. Pauline Kael, writing in The New Yorker, dismissed the film as one of several schlocky releases that substituted pretentious eccentricity for genuine substance. The San Mateo Times called it the freak show of the year. The Tribune reviewer wrote that Brando gives the impression that he sprawled through the wall from the movie next door. What united all of these? Responses was the application of the wrong evaluative standard. The expectation that a Western starring Brando and Nicholson should deliver the coherent mythological grandeur that the Western's classical tradition had trained audiences to expect. The critics were measuring the Missouri Breaks against Shane. Penn had made the Missouri Breaks specifically because Shane was a lie. They reviewed the film they had been promised. They did not review the film they watched. Seen from the distance of 50 years, through the lens of everything that has since been documented about the convergence of capital and institutional violence that characterized the actual settlement of the American West, about the Johnson County War and the Cattle King massacres, and the legal machinery that protected property while criminalizing survival, the Missouri Breaks reads as the most precisely correct Western ever made. Clayton's license killing is not aberrant. It is the system functioning as designed. Logan's rustling is not villainy. It is the unauthorized application of the same survival logic that Braxton employs with institutional sanction. The film's refusal to provide a moral framework for distinguishing between them is not confusion, it is accuracy. The critics who demanded clarity were demanding that Penn tell them which form of violence was legitimate. Penn's answer, embedded in the film's structure and delivered with absolute consistency through every scene Brando improvised and every line Towne rewrote, was that the only thing distinguishing legitimate violence from illegitimate violence in the American West was the price Braxton had paid for Clayton's contract. That answer was too uncomfortable for 1976 to receive. It has been aging into truth ever since. The film that survived is chaotic. It is also, in its chaos, more honest than the orderly masterpiece the studio had purchased. Penn spent his career attacking American mythology, in a Philadelphia living room with Helen Keller, on a Louisiana highway with Bonnie and Clyde, in a Cheyenne encampment with Little Big Man, and the Missouri Breaks was the production where the myth fought back hardest. Brando turned the film's villain into a performance. Nicholson filed a lawsuit over unpaid royalties. McGuane called the production a nightmare and left the country. Towne rewrote the ending without credit. A horse drowned in the Yellowstone River. And Penn stood in the middle of all of it and said, in the most honest directorial statement he ever made, that he did not know why he was making the film, which was, in the end, the most accurate thing anyone said about a production that had been assembled on a lie, funded by the salary disparity between its stars and its supporting actress, and completed despite the active indifference of its most visible participant. But here's the question that the Missouri Breaks leaves embedded in that cue card garden, in the cabbage patch where Brando hid the lines he had not learned. If the most savage critique of how American capitalism uses licensed violence to protect the interests of the powerful was produced by a film whose own payroll demonstrated exactly that dynamic, with two male stars earning 50 times the salary of the woman whose performance held the film together, then what does it mean when a film tells the truth about power while reproducing that power's logic in its own production? And if the answer is that Hollywood has always been most honest about the system when it is simultaneously most embedded in it, what does that tell you about every other film that has ever claimed to critique the world it was made inside? Leave that in the comments. If this investigation changed how you see the Missouri Breaks, leave a like, because there are 1,000 films with buried secrets that deserve the same forensic attention, and the algorithm needs to know this kind of digging matters.